So today I was going to talk a little bit about postmodernism and what is it? Who knows, basically. It's one of the things that's very amorphous. You hear a lot of people using the term, if not incorrectly, as something that's broader that encompasses a lot of other things that aren't really related to postmodernism. So I'm going to kind of work through it for a little bit, try to get you to see what's happening with postmodern literature, how that is a sort of a condition of postmodernism or a symptom of postmodernism, and how we got there, basically. So before I go any further, I wanted to show you this book. And it's a pretty good book to have if you're just doing lit in general. So if you're taking American Lit Part 1, Part 2, so on. This is all about American literature. Let me see if I can get it up here. And it's a pretty good book in general. I'll move so you can get the authors there. But basically, it's From Puritanism to Postmodernism. There we go, getting the light. By Richard Rowland and Malcolm Bradbury. And it covers everything, like literally it says, from Puritanism to postmodernism. It covers everything. And the nice thing about this book is it hits a lot of the major works. So, for instance, if you're writing about Ernest Hemingway for your final paper, you know, he gets some mentions in here. William Carlos Williams and so on. They even have a chapter where they make a direct reference to William Carlos Williams and the American Grain, was a series of poems and essays he wrote. So as you think about if you're pursuing American literature or pondering American literature, this is a really good starter book where it just kind of traces it from the beginning, all the movements, all the people who showed up that are big deals, okay? Doesn't hit everybody, and then talks about some of the stuff that's going on. So I just wanted to read this one passage really quickly, and hopefully this will help explain things. And so this is on 372 if you ever decide to get the book. And it said, by mid-century, the word fiction pointed everywhere to a sea change of truly revolutionary proportions. The post-war world, the cultural drive toward what has become known as the postmodern, can be viewed as opposed responses to the challenges of heterodoxy, a root disagreement reducible to the distinction between the adjective the and a. Is reality single and ultimately unknowable? Is truth therefore verifiable and constant? Or is it multiple and time-bound? And finally, the question is central to interpretation in life as in art. Can we hope for the meaning of a historical event or poem, or must we do as best we can with a meaning? Okay, and it continues on from there. So a lot of what some people would say would be $5 words that are going on in there. But the key is with this, the difference between the and a. If you think about postmodernism, the thing that was happening was that there was a sort of a loss of God as an answer, okay, to or an engine behind everything that's happening. And so modernism was trying to figure out, okay, so what is the answer, capital A? What takes the place of this particular thing? And so you have a bunch of different movements that occur over time in the United States, and some of it, like for instance in the 10s and 20s, socialism, unionization, communism going into the 30s and 40s, are all things that people proffer as an answer to the ills that society has, and maybe can no longer you can no longer depend on organized religion to provide individuals with those particular answers. And so what you see is these broad movements in modernism where you have a bunch of people thinking that yes, this is the answer. Now when we get to postmodernism, when we get to the 40s and 50s and then onwards to what we think today, although some people have said that postmodernism stopped around the turn of the century, what we see now is the idea that everything is inherently subjective. So it's no longer a bunch of people, okay, or one gigantic movement encompassing a bunch of people, but rather a series of individual movements, okay, that's based on one person's subjective idea of what the answer is. All right, and so this will manifest itself if you think about people like Jack Kerouac, okay, and Allen Ginsberg. Their answers will be very subjective. Kerouac, Eastern religion is something, homosexuality, drug use, like wandering the deserts, all of those trying to find himself, and we'll put that in quotation marks. You see that a lot in postmodern literature, people just sort of trying to figure out what's going on, but doing so from a very personalized perspective. This is, of course, not surprisingly, the era where we get into issues of identity, right? So what does it mean if you're African American? What does it mean if you're a woman? What does it mean if you're transgender or gay? So what does it mean if you're disabled or Native American? And those all become very intensely personal terms. And so you see, again, things that were normally like, women's suffrage, okay, in the 1920s, a massive movement that ended with women getting the right to vote, and also prohibition was a part of that too. Now going into the 60s and 70s, less of a broad movement and more of an individualized, what does it mean if I am a woman? What does it mean if I am gay? What does it mean if I'm African American or Hispanic, or Latino? These sorts of things, right? All come down to issues of individual identity as the things that they're trying to achieve in order to get that answer, right? So in other words, there's no big answer. There's no one big solution that everyone can march towards, but instead everyone's just kind of shooting off in different directions now and trying their best to come up with sort of a personal solution. Now, as we go from modernism into postmodernism, a lot of the same sort of themes will be there, but you'll see less of a broad sweep. So in other words, a modern novel will have a series, a whole bunch of different individuals, okay, and a more typical, slightly more typical structure where there's a climax and all this other stuff. Postmodernism just basically destroys the last vestiges of what is correct in literature. So you will see people, reinvent what a poem is entirely. Modernists would poke around and they would say, well, let's see if I do this and I do this, but they still were sort of laboring under, this is what a sonnet is, a short story must look like this, it must have a climax at this point. Postmodernists just say, get rid of all of that. We're going to start from scratch. And so it's not surprising that we see postmodern literature, a whole bunch of different things that we normally wouldn't think of as literature from a more classical perspective have appeared. And so, like for instance, The Mezzanine, which is a novel that's on our reading list, has footnotes, extensive footnotes, that break apart the narrative. And really the narrative is one guy, and this was a novel, okay, about 150 some pages. One guy goes across the street on his lunch hour to buy a pair of shoelaces, okay? And that's the entire purpose of the novel. But as he goes, he's searching for something. He's sort of unmoored. He doesn't have an answer. So one of the classic sequences that I appreciated was what he talked about when he was younger. He'd reach for a brass doorknob, and he was always fascinated because it looked like there were 15 or 16 different hands reaching towards the doorknob. You read that and you think, what the hell is he thinking? What is the purpose of this? But the idea that's there is that his own reality, his own truth, is entirely subjective and is based on personal experiences. And so you see this if you've seen there's the book The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz. That too has extensive footnotes, even though it's a novel, and the footnotes are mostly fictionalized too. So you see people doing this. This is where we get graphic novels, okay? So Art Spiegelman's Mouse, okay, comes in and becomes a big deal. Persepolis is another graphic novel, whereas before, graphic novels and comics, in whatever sense that you want, drawn pictures with bubbles over the top of them, however you want to define those, were mostly relegated to the funny pages and were mostly considered to be lowbrow humor, lowbrow art. And then suddenly, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, not counting superhero comics or superhero graphic novels, a lot of them have started to get literary respect, and that's because the truth or reality becomes an intensely personalized thing. And so you can take a look at a lot of graphic novels that are more semi-autobiographical. They, like Jeff Lemire, will have some like Underwater Welder. There's a whole bunch of them. Stuck Rubber Baby, I can't remember who did that. There's a whole bunch of different graphic novels that came out in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s that are intensely personal. And so you see that happening also in what we would say would be our more conventional literature, the stuff that you find in your anthology. And you'll see that the characters are much the same, that they are sort of stuck. There may be one or two other characters that are there, but they're desperately trying to figure out, okay, now what? Okay, I've been told that this isn't the solution, and all these big movements, they didn't do a damn thing either. So now what, right? So I'm turning in on myself. What are some of the possibilities? What are some of the answers that are out there? And in some cases, there aren't any, okay? And if you're writing a short story, it's really easy not to have an answer. You just have 15 pages and you're done. You're like, okay, guys. But again, you see, too, that the onus becomes even more on the reader to make meaning out of the particular work. Whereas before, if we go all the way back to stuff like White Heron, Wife of His Youth, Margaret Fleming, those sorts of plays, they bludgeoned you, okay, with their meaning. They would actually have like a White Heron at the end, a little postscript that said, this is what you're supposed to think about the story, okay. Same thing with the Wife of His Youth. Really, the way that ends is that you are supposed to like draw the lesson that the author wanted you to have. Now there's no lessons that they're offering. They're sort of painting a picture and letting you do the work. All right? And so that's why when you get to postmodernism, a lot of times students can be very frustrated because it just seems like it's a story like Raymond Carver, you know, just two guys and a woman who's passed out, all in a house, and the guys are sitting there and they're trying to draw a picture. And that's the plot, okay? But again, you have to figure out what the personal sort of circumstances are, what the subjective reality that's at work there. So again, just kind of to recap really quickly, and I have to say that if you can do worse than picking up this book, basically. It's not required or anything of that nature, but if you're doing American Lit 1 or 2, this is a pretty handy reference to have. Again, it doesn't go through everything, but if you're like, what the devil are these people thinking? You can just go to the index, you know, and pull out the appropriate chapter, and I think that gives you some background. But again, just to recap, our movement from modernism to postmodernism, they're related, okay, in some ways. That's why it's postmodernism. But now the circumstances have changed somewhat. Our experimentation that we had in modernism goes full-bore experimentation when we get to postmodernism. In modernism, the idea that there's some sort of big, broad movement that's out there that will sort of change things or make things better or give people meaning was tried out. It didn't really work. So when we get to postmodernism, and postmodernism starts in 1945-ish, okay, remember there's not a direct date, but with postmodernism, keep in mind this is all after World War II. We've seen the Holocaust, we've seen the A-bomb, all of these sorts of things, and now there is this idea, if you remember with Robert Oppenheimer, you know, his famous quote after the A-bomb went off is, you know, I've become destroyer of worlds. Now, people themselves have almost godlike powers, all right? So the idea of these broad movements sort of dissipate, and now truth and reality become entirely subjective. And so that's where some people have said, if we take a look at the most recent events in the news over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, the idea of what truth is, with a capital T, is now under assault. And some people have said, okay, well, maybe that's a symptom of no longer being in postmodernism, because you still had truth, it was just your truth, okay? Now we're being told that truth is in, like, my truth is different from your truth, and they can both coexist. Even though, you know, I can go out and statistically prove something, you can say, no, I disagree with that because I don't like it. And then your opinion is somehow valid as a result of that. So you take that subjectivity and you crank it all the way to the max, so that truth and facts and data are all no longer a thing. And that's, some people have said, okay, well, that's the next step of postmodernism, that the one thing that everyone sort of shared, truth itself, no longer exists. All right, so then everything, like, it becomes intensely subjective. Some people have said maybe we're in postmodernism. There's no term for it yet because we're still living in the era, and it may just be a blip on the radar. We could still be in postmodernism, just sort of a weird thing that happened during that phase. But stuff to consider, okay, as you read our postmodern works, is definitely moving from that larger truth to that smaller subjective truth, definitely moving more experimentation along the way, and really just individuals trying to find an answer, like, what is my purpose? If everything in the middle, if I peel back all the layers of this reality, and what's in the middle, according to our existentialists, is nothing but absurdity, so what do I get out of that? Okay, how do I make meaning out of just a completely absurd or pointless existence? Used to be you join your union. Used to be that you joined a literary club, or you became an artist, or something like that. And then in postmodernism, it became like, this is your own thing, and it can be based on your identity. So we see identity becoming sort of a predominant factor, even all the way up to our current political age, and so on. So stuff to consider there as you read postmodern literature. It can be frustrating because it's just like people talking, or just kind of doing stuff, and they're not really doing anything in our conventional sense. If we think about our realists, like this happened and then this happened and then this happened, they're a little bit easier to follow. In some of our postmodern works, a lot of students have said, well, nothing happened, and that's probably true. But with what you make out of it, what is your interpretation of that? What is the author doing with these individual characters? That's really the ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve there. So that's postmodernism in a nutshell, about 15 minutes. So hopefully that clarifies things. Hopefully I didn't make things too much more complex. But otherwise, if you have any questions, feel free to answer those. Postmodernism, our final era, and as we go through American Lit Part 2.